In this video, I'm going to show you how to create this really simple multi-step form in React. And there's about a million different ways to create this type of application, but I'm going to show you a way that uses custom hooks and is incredibly flexible, so it can be applied to pretty much any project you can think of. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And to get started, I just have a completely blank page on the left in VS Code, and on the right, I have a final version of our application. So as you can see, we can enter information inside of here. We can click next, and if we go back, all that information is still there. We have a counter in the top telling us how many pages we have. And as we enter all of this different information, we finally get to the very end where we can enter the last bit of information. And when we click finish, it would do something like say that you're signed up or whatever it is that you want it to do. It'll just do whatever you want at the end. So it has a full multi-step form functionality. You can go backwards, you can go forward. It also works for like if you have required fields, you're required to fill those out before you can even go to the next step. It's got a lot of functionality and it's pretty simple what we're going to do. So to get started for this project, I'm going to be using React and TypeScript. So I'm going to say npm create Vite, and that's going to create me a Vite application. And here I just say that I want to install this. And now it's going to ask me what my project name is. We'll just call it React Multi-Step Form, just like that. And we're going to be using React, and I want to use TypeScript, so we'll say React TS. Now you'll see it puts it inside this folder here. I'm just going to move everything out of that folder because we're already in our own folder. And now I can run npm I, and that's going to install all of my different dependencies. And then I can run npm run dev once that's done to run a basic version of our application. And you'll see inside of here we have a bunch of different files, and I want to get rid of most of them. I don't really care about the default CSS or the icons that they have inside of here. All I want to do is just have a basic index HTML, and I want an app here that has essentially nothing at all inside of it. We're just going to return the text, or we'll just do an h1 that says hi. There we go. So now if I just run npm run dev and just give it a second, it should pop that up. You can see if we just click on this link, now we're running our application. It has the text hi, super straightforward. Now, before we even go ahead and start writing out anything for your HTML of our application, I want to get started with that custom hook. So we can come in here, we can create a new file called useMultistepForm.ts, because this is going to be a TypeScript file. And we can just export that custom hook, which is useMultistepForm. Just like that. And inside of this custom hook, we're going to pass in just one single parameter, and that parameter is going to be an array of all of our different steps. So if you look over here, we have an address section, we have a user details section, and we have this account setup. And essentially each one is a React component, and that React component has all these different inputs and so on in it. So all we're going to do is just pass an array of different React components to this function, and that's going to be how we render out our steps. So inside of here, we're going to pass it an array of steps. And those steps are going to be React elements and an array of them. So this is saying any type of React component, for example, a form right here that we have, we're going to pass an array of those to this hook. And this hook is going to manage all of the state for what step we're on, making sure we render out that step, getting this counter working properly, making sure these buttons work properly. All of that is going to be handled by this one custom hook. So inside of here, what we need to do is we need to first track what step we're currently on. So we can just say const current step index, and this is going to be coming from state, so we can say set current step index is equal to using state, and by default we're just going to set this to 0 because we want to start on the very first step. Then at the bottom here we can just return that current step index. And now currently what we've done is we just said, hey, we have a step index, it starts at 0, and we're returning that to be used. But obviously we want to have ways to go forward and backwards in our steps. We also want to return the current step. That's actually pretty easy. The current step is just going to be our steps at the current step index. And I'm just going to call this step instead of current step. So this right now is returning us our current step. And if we want to go forward or backwards, we're going to need to create some functions. So we'll create a next function. We'll also create a function called back that allows us to go back. And then a final function called goTo. And this goTo function is just going to take in an index, which is a number. And we're just going to go to that exact index in our step. So what we can do is for the goTo, it's super easy. We can just set our current step index to our index, just like that. This is about as easy as it gets for our goTo function, and we can return that down here, goTo. So now we have a goTo function. Now we'll make our next function, which is pretty easy again. We want to call that set current step index. We want to get the index that we are currently on, which we'll just put as a variable of I. And all I want to do inside of here is I just want to add 1 to I. So we'll say I plus 1, and we'll return that. But if I'm at the very end of my page, I actually don't want to add 1 to this. So if my index here is greater than my steps.length minus 1, that means that I've already at the last step. Let's make this greater than or equal to. This means I'm already at the last step or beyond. In that case, I just want to return the current index. I don't want to increment it. Otherwise, do increment it by 1. And for our back button, we're going to do almost the exact same thing. But if our index here is less than or equal to 0, then I do not want to subtract 1 from it because I'm already on the very first step. So these are just making sure I don't go out of bounds, essentially. So now we can have next and back inside of here. And right there, that's a lot of the logic we need inside of this hook already taken care of. We can move forward steps, backward steps, go to a specific step, and we have access to that exact step right now. So with that done, let's actually go ahead and try to start implementing some of this before we run into the problems with dealing with data. So back inside of our app.tx here, what we can do is we can actually return some information. In our case, we're going to want to have a div, and that div is going to be like this card type of look here with that border around it. And then inside of that, we're going to have our form, which contains all of our information for our, our first name, last name, age, and so on. So inside this main div here, let's add a custom style to it because we're going to want to make it look just like what we have over here on the right. So the first thing I want to do is I want to change the position to relative. The reason for that is that this numbering system up here is going to be absolutely positioned, so we need this to be relative. We're going to change the background here to be white. We're going to also add a border, which is just a simple 1 pixel solid black. All of these styles are really basic, but that's because the point of this tutorial is not about the CSS. It's entirely going to be about the JavaScript and the React. So for padding, we'll do 2 rem. We're also going to have a margin of 1 rem. Whoops. A border radius in here to give us some rounded corners, and that's just going to be 0.5 rem. And then finally, I'm going to change the font family so it's not quite so ugly. We'll just make it Arial by default. So with that done, we have all of that we need. Over here, you can see we have nothing, but we have this rectangle showing up for our actual card container where our form is going to go. Now, the first thing I want to do inside of our form is I actually want to put a div, and that div is going to be for handling our current step and our total steps. As you can see here, we have 1 out of 3. That's what this div is going to be for. So for our styling for it, we need to make sure we absolutely position this. So we'll say the position is going to be absolute on that. We also want to specify the top is 0.5 rem, so it's in the top, and the right is going to be 0.5 rem, so it's also going to be in the right-hand corner. So this is going to be in the top right-hand corner, and inside of here, what we need to do is we need to get our current step, and we need to get our total steps. So for example, this would say step 1 out of 2, if we're on the very first out of 2 steps. That's what I want to have written here, but we need to obviously use that hook in order to get that information. So we'll come in here, and we'll implement that hook. We'll just say const is equal to useMultistepForm. And we need to pass it an array of steps. In our case, we'll just pass it an empty array for now. And we'll come in here, we can say that we're going to be getting our steps, but we don't have access to our steps from our form. And what you could do is you could say const steps equals the empty array, pass in your steps here, and then you have access to that steps variable and you don't need to get it from here. But this is a little bit annoying in my opinion to do. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to make it so that our hook automatically returns the steps we pass in. That just makes working with this kind of stuff a little bit easier. So now if I come back, you can see we have our steps. We can get our current step index. And now down here, we can just replace these values. So this is our current step index plus 1 because we're 0 indexed for arrays. We want it to start with 1 instead of 0. And this is just our steps.length. So for now, it's just going to say 1 out of 0 because we are currently an empty array, which is obviously something that would never happen. This is going to be an array with multiple elements inside of it. But if we come in here, we put like a div that says 1, and we'll come in here, we'll put another div, and this one will say 2. There we go. Now we have 2 elements that are being passed. They're just React JSX elements. And you can see now we're on page 1 out of 2 because we're starting at step 0, which is our very first step right here. Now the next thing I want to do is render out the step that we're currently on. So I'm going to get that up here from our hook. And we're just going to render that out right below. So now you can see we're on step 1. And if we were on the next step, for example, if I just manually change this here to be an index of 1, now we're going to be on step number 2 as soon as I do a refresh, as you can see right there. But obviously we want this to start at 0, and we're going to implement logic for our buttons, which is the very next thing I want to add. So let's create a container for our buttons. We'll do that right here, and we're going to add some manual styles to this. Again, just really basic styles. We'll put a little bit of margin on the top of 1 rem to space it out from the actual form. We're also going to change the display here. Display, that's going to be flex. And the reason we're doing that is so we can just add a gap of 0.5 rem, and so we can justify the content on the flex end. That's just going to put our buttons on the far right-hand side of the container. So as you can see, it's already added some space for us. Now let's add in some buttons. We'll just say back, and we'll say next. There we go. As you can see, we now have those buttons showing up. And if we come over here, you can see it's very similar to what we have over here. But obviously, we don't want to show the back button on the very first page, and we don't want to show the next button on the very last page. So we have a little bit of logic we need to write to make sure we show only the correct buttons. So for our back button, if we're on the very first step, I don't want to show it. So one way I could do that is I could say if our current step index is equal to 0, that means we're on the very first step, so I don't want to show it. So if it's not equal to 0, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to render out this button like this. This is one way to do this, and now on the very first step, you'll see that that doesn't show up, but if we go to the second step, it would show up. But I don't like having to manually write this code inside of my app TSX. I prefer to just have this logic taken care of for me because I may need to do it in many places. So instead, I'm going to create a variable called isFirstStep. And this variable is going to come from our hook here. So isFirstStep, and inside of that hook, we can just return isFirstStep just like that. And that's just going to be if we're on the very first step. So if our index is equal to 0, then we're going to return that. So here, if we're not on the first step, return the back button. And our back button is going to have a simple onClick, and this onClick is just going to use that back function. So let's create that back function right here. Now, as you can see, we're calling that back function when we click the back button. Same exact thing here. We're going to make this be our next function, which we're going to get from our hook. Next, just like that. And now when I click next, you'll notice it moves me to page 2. But of course, you're seeing there's a little bit of a problem. It's going next and then it's going back. The reason for this is because by default, all buttons are submit buttons, so our form is being submitted every time we click a button. So for now, let's just change the type here of our button to be button, and that'll prevent our form from being submitted because when you submit a form, it's going to automatically refresh your page if you give your form no properties. So now when I click next, you see we go to the next page, and back we go to the previous page, so this is working fine. And it doesn't matter if I click next multiple times, it's not going to actually proceed to the next page because we're already on the very last page. Now this is going to present some problems though, but we're going to tackle those in a little bit. The next thing I want to do though for our button is I want to make it so that if we're on the last page, we're going to be calling or having our text be slightly different. So if we are on the last step, then I want our text to say finish. Otherwise, I want it to say next. And this is last step we can just get from our hook, just like we did for the first step. So we'll just put that in there, come in here, we'll say is last step, and that's going to be current step index is equal here to our steps.length -1. That's going to give us the very last step. If we're on the last step, this will be true. So now when I go to the last step, you can see it says finish instead of next, which is exactly what we want. Now I mentioned we're going to run in some problems by using the type of button here, and in order to see what those problems are, we need to actually create our different steps. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new file. We'll call this one userForm.tsx, export function, userForm. And this user form is going to be really simple. It's just going to return some HTML. And this HTML is going to look like this. I'm just going to copy this in. Essentially, we have a first name, we have a last name, and we have an age. And the main thing about these is all the fields here are required. Age has a minimum of 1, and we're auto-focusing on our very first input. And that way, when we render that input, it'll be the first thing that gets our focus. I'm going to do the exact same thing with an address form. Whoops, .tsx. There we go. Export function. Address form. And inside of here, we're just going to return essentially the exact same thing, but this time we're going to have address related information. Again, they're all required, and the very first one has autofocus. Lastly, we're going to come to our final step, which is our account form.tsx, export function, account form. And we just make sure that we're going to return this information. And again, it's exactly the same, autofocus on the first, all the other ones are required. So now with those 3 different forms created, what we can do is we can actually use them inside of our multi-step form. So in our app, instead of just passing along these divs, I want to pass along these components. So we have a user form that we're going to pass along. We have an address form that we're going to pass along. And then we finally have an account form that we're going to pass along. We just want to make sure all of these are getting imported. So now if I save, you can see we have our address, our user form, we have our address form, and we have our account form. But but our styles are not quite 100% there. So in order to style this properly, I'm going to essentially add another component that's going to wrap all of our different components that we have here for our forms, and that's just going to be for consistency's sake. I'm going to create a new file. This one's going to be called form wrapper.tsx, and this is just going to be for those styles. So export that form wrapper. Now this form wrapper is going to take in two different properties. We're going to have a title, and we're also going to have the children. So the title is just this label at the very top here, for example, user details or address, and the children is just going to be everything inside of the form wrapper, so all the different form elements. And what we want to do is we want this to have a form wrapper props as the type, and we need to create that type. So we'll say form wrapper props. Our title is super simple, that's a string, but our children is a little bit complex. We need to use a type called React Node. This React Node type is a special type in React that allows you to accept any type of children, a single child, an array of children, a string, anything that can be used as a React JSX child will be accepted by React Node. It's just a special React type specifically for this. Now inside of here, we need to return all of our information. The first thing we're going to have is an h2 element. That's going to be where our title goes. And then we need to obviously return our children, but we're going to wrap them inside of a div for different styling purposes. So for our title here, let's just give them some really simple styles. We want to have text align, that's going to be in the center. Margin 0, that's just going to remove the margin around it like on the top. And we're going to add back in the margin on the bottom. So we'll say margin bottom is 2 rem, just like that. So now we have our title portion done. Let's do our children. And again, for this, it's going to be super straightforward. Again, the styles don't really matter. I'm just using these so it's not super ugly to look at. So we're going to do a display of grid. We're going to give a gap here of 1 rem and 0.5 rem to space out each element from one another. We're going to justify the content at the flex start. So that's just going to be at the very beginning. And then we're going to set up our grid template columns. So grid template columns. We're going to have two columns. The first one is the label, so we want to auto size that. And the second one is going to be for our actual input. And we're going to use a simple min max for that, where by default, the smallest size it'll be is just auto sized, and the largest size it'll be is 400 pixels. And that's just so it doesn't become too large of an element for us. So now with that out of the way, let's just save, and we have all the code for our form wrapper done. So let's implement that on our user form. Here, we'll just use that form wrapper, pass it a title, which says user details, and make sure we close that off right here. So now if I save, you can see our form is now styled correctly by using grid on the bottom, and this title is showing up just like we want. Let's do the exact same thing for our address. So I'm just going to paste that in. Here, this is going to say address. Make sure that we import this and copy that down there. Now let's do the final thing on our account form. This will just say account creation, doesn't really matter. Get that in there and copy this down. So now all three of our forms look 100% like we want them to, but obviously we already see the issue with our next and previous button not working correctly based on that type of button. And that's because when I click next, even though all of these user fields are required, it's not actually checking these to make sure that the actual valid values are there. So instead, what I want to do in my app is I want to change the type of our button here for next to be a submit button. And that's going to mean that we submit our form every time. So now when I click next, you're noticing that it's kind of refreshing my page. It's not working exactly like I want it to. And the reason for that is because we're submitting automatically. So what I want to do is I want to actually remove this next right here. And instead, I want to move that to an onSubmit handler for our form. We're just going to call a function called onSubmit. I'm going to create that up here, function onSubmit, which is going to take in a form event object. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to prevent the default. That's going to prevent the page from doing that automatic refresh thing that I talked about. And then the next thing that I want to do is I want to call that next function. So we'll just call next like this. So now just by doing this one step, when I click next, you'll notice it tries to submit the form by doing the normal onSubmit, and it's noticing these fields are not filled in properly. So it's telling me, hey, add a name, add a last name, add an age. And now when I click next, it's going through the onSubmit. It prevents the default behavior of refreshing the page, and it's calling my next function just like it worked before. But now we actually have the form checking to make sure everything's correct. But you'll notice when I go back and forth, obviously none of my state is being saved because we don't have any state information at all in our application yet. Now to actually handle this data, it's going to be fairly straightforward. What I can do is I can create a local state variable. We're just going to call this data and set data. And by default, we're going to use some state that's set to an initial data variable. Just like that. It's just going to be a variable we create up here. And it's going to be an object. Now I'm just going to paste in our initial data because we just have all of our different properties: first name, last name, age, street, city, state, zip, email, password. They are all just an empty string to start. And we're going to give this a type as well, which is going to be form data. So let's just create a type, form data, and we're going to equal that here. And I'm again going to just copy over the code for this because it's super straightforward. Everything is a string, so we just typed everything to be a string. You don't want to see me type this out, so let's just copy it over. So now we have our use state, which is this initial data, which is a form data. And what we want to do is we want to pass that data down to all of our components. So we can just say here, data, just like that. And that's going to allow us to pass down all of the data to each one of these components. And when we save, we're obviously going to have some errors because we're not currently accepting data into any of these components. But it'll look something like this. In our user form, we're going to be taking in a first name, a last name, and an age. And this is going to be our user form props. User form props. And we're going to have our first name, which is a string, last name, string, and an age, which is a string as well, just like that. And now that's going to get rid of the errors for our user form here. But we also need a way to update this state because we could pass in all of our information. So if we go back here, we could say, for example, the value of our input is going to be first name. We could copy that down for all three of these. So we have our last name and we have our age, last name, age, and now that's going to put those values in there, but we have no way to update them. We need some type of method, which for example would be like update fields, which is going to allow us to update each one of these fields. And the way I envision this update fields function working is something like this. You would say update fields and you would pass it an update. For example, first name is going to be Kyle, and this would update the first name to be Kyle. Or you could add in last name to be Cook, and now it'll update the first and last name properly. So that's how this is going to work. So let's actually implement that function here. We can just say function update fields, and this update fields function is going to take in some fields, and those fields are going to be the type of form data, but we don't want to pass in the full exact form data every time. We just want to pass in some partial version of it. And luckily in TypeScript, we have a type called partial. And if we use the partial type, it allows us to essentially pass in a partial version of any type. So everything is optional. So we only need to pass in, any of the values. It doesn't have to be all of them at once. Otherwise, without that, we would need to pass in every single one of these types every single time we called this function. So now in this update fields, we can set our data. And of course, we want to get our previous data from the last render. And with this, what we want to do is we just want to return. We take all of the current values and we add in all of the new values. We're just overriding all the old information with the new information. And now we can pass update fields here to each one of these functions, or each one of these components, sorry. So there we go. We've now passed that into each one of the components. And inside of here, we need to make this update fields type. So we can just come in here and say update fields. We know that this is a function that takes in some fields, and it's going to return to us nothing, void. But what is the type of this fields here? Well, the type of fields is anything between first name, last name, and age, or any combination of them. So to make this a little bit easier, I'm going to create another type. This type is going to be called user data. And that's just going to be first name, last name, age. And here, I'm going to say that this is going to be the type of user data and. So that essentially just combines our two types together. It has all of these properties plus this new property. And these fields is again just going to be a partial of any of our user data. So again, the way that this is working is we're saying update fields, when we call it, we can pass any information between first name, last name, age. We can pass none of them, all of them, or any amount of them. That's what partial allows us to do. And that is going to be our fields right here. So in an on change, what we could do is we could get our E value and we could say update fields. We're going to pass in our property here, which is first name. And that first name is going to be set to e.target.value. And now if I save, you can see we can now update this first name property, but of course it's not actually working as we expect. The reason for this is if we go back here, this is update fields. So I just spelled this wrong. So let's just spell that correctly on all of those. So now we can update that first name property and it's working just fine. If I go next, if I actually finish this, so let's finish our user form here. That way I can actually click the next button. I'll just copy this down. Actually, we just need the on change. I'm just going to copy that to each one of these. And here we want this to be the last name. And this one down here is the age. So now if I fill out all of this information, click next and go back, you can see our data is being persisted because now we're storing it in state. And every single time we render out a component, we're passing down the data as well as a way to update that data for each one of our different components. So now all we need to do is do the same thing we did for our user form in our address form and our other forms. I'm going to kind of copy over this into our address form because it's going to be pretty similar. We're going to have a street property. We're going to have a city. Here we're going to have a state. Then finally, we're going to have our zip code section. And this is going to be our address data, just like that. And this is our address form props. And again, our update field is going to work the same. We just pass in our address data instead. So now I'm going to copy this because this is going to be almost again the exact same for all of these. This will be our street. And here we update our street. That should be exactly how this works. Make sure I spell street properly. And of course, we need to make sure we get all these props. So street, city, state, zip, and update fields comes from that address form props. Should have no errors there. And now I can just copy this down to each one of our different inputs. And I just want to make sure that for our city, we're updating our city. For our state, updating our state. And for our zip, we're updating our zip. And now if I come in here, you can see I can enter in information for all of these, go next, go back. It's all still going to be there for all of these different things. Now finally, the account creation, very similar. I'm again just going to copy this over, paste this down. We only have two. We have our email and our password, just like that. So here, this is going to be our account data. And this will say account form props. And let's get in our email, our password, update fields. And finally, I'll just copy over this information again. So we can just paste that down. And instead of street, we're going to have email. And instead of street down here, password. There we go. So now hopefully all of this information should be fine to fill in. Let's just do all of that real quick. Email. And we click finish and we are not getting any errors. So this should be submitting our form. Also, I need to make sure here that this is using our address. Whoops. Account form props. There we go. That'll just fix the type right there. So now if we go back to our app here, we're calling this submit function. Whoops. This submit function right here every time we click next. But we only want to go to the next page when we're on all the pages except for the last. So if we are on the last page, so if is last step, if it's not the last step, then let's call next and do nothing else. So we'll just return right here. Otherwise, we want to do something. For now, I'll just say alert successful account creation. So now we should only call this alert function whenever we click the finish button. So let's go back to the beginning here. When I click next, it goes to the next step. Click next, again, it's still going to the next step, but now we're on the last step, so it should skip this and instead do this alert. And as you can see, it says alert successful account creation. And here is where you could do anything like a fetch request to post this data to some type of API, whatever it is you need to do, that can go right here. Also, one final thing we should probably do is fix some CSS styles. You'll notice when this is very zoomed out, it's way wider than it should be. We just need to set the max width to be our max content. And that'll just make it so our container here is never actually wider than the content inside of it, which is what we want. And that's all it takes to create a multi-step React form. If you want to see me attempt this in JavaScript completely live and unscripted, that's going to be linked over here, as well as another advanced React project that's written in TypeScript. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.